Good morning, I'm Becky Pleasant. I work for Magnox Limited, a nuclear decommissioning organisation, but I'm currently seconded out to ECITB, who in turn second me out to the NSSG, organisations I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. But today, as well as talking about those organisations, I'll also be talking about the outputs of a series of workshops that we've had both within the nuclear sector, but also with other sectors on the topic of transferability. The topic has always been important, but as we face energy transition, I think it will be more important than ever. And one positive that has come out of the recent global pandemic is that we have demonstrated that we can work flexibly and adapt to different environments. This will be important going forward. Transfers already happen in the sector, and I'm a case in point myself. I started out working in banking, then moved to assurance, moved on to FMCG, then did some work with a commercial education company, and then landed in nuclear accidentally 13 years ago. Perhaps it is easier in the business functions than it is in some other areas, but the purpose of today's workshop and ongoing discussions is to try and explore how we can make that easier for other people and remove the barriers to transferring within and between sectors. Next slide, please. So the session objectives are to give you a little bit of detail and background around the organisations that I work for and the nuclear sector deal, which both organisations are involved with. As I say, to share the learning from those previous workshops on skills transferability, but also to share the output of a report that was commissioned by ECITB on the topic of transferability. And then we'll go on to talk about the experience of the nuclear sector to date and work being undertaken to address these issues and perhaps where others can get involved. Next slide, please. So the ECITB are a non-departmental public body led by industry. We develop and accredit qualifications and occupational standards, and we work with employers to identify skills requirements, which we then grant support training for. We also undertake strategic initiatives to address cross-industry skills needs. It's important to say that we have an industrial training levy, which was established under the Industrial Training Act, which brings income, which we then invest in skills interventions across the sector. And each year we invest about £20 million in these types of interventions. The levy is consensual in that it is voted for by industry on the back of a strategy that we issue. This was supported by industry over a year or so ago, so we're currently delivering interventions and training on behalf of the sector using levy raised from the sector. Next slide, please. So the ECITB are in a fortunate position to span a number of different sectors. One of the benefits that it has is that it can encourage those sectors to not work so much in silos, to help break down those silos. It can share good practice and can invest in solutions that result from this sharing. These are a list of the types of sectors that we're currently working with, and across all of those, transferability of skills is a core element in all of our strategy elements. Next slide, please. In terms of the Nuclear Skills Strategy Group, this is an industry body working with governments, trade unions and regulators coming together to have a single voice on nuclear skills, a single strategic voice on nuclear skills. And skills for nuclear, importantly. This group identifies interventions that would be enhanced through collaborative effort. We're responsible for labour market intelligence for nuclear sector, and we produce an annual nuclear workforce assessment which identifies the skills demands now and looking forward for the next 10-15 years. It's important to say that we're not a delivery body. We work with partners to deliver the interventions that need to be delivered, and that might be industry themselves, or it might be skills bodies or educational providers, but together we then identify and develop the solutions to the problems that industry have identified need solving. Next slide, please. So following the industrial strategy, nuclear were identified as one of the sectors to form a deal with government. We were selected because of the opportunity presented to help raise productivity through people and in terms of addressing the clean growth grand challenge. Next slide, please. So the NSSG were asked to author the people element of the nuclear sector deal and be responsible for delivering it. Within the sector deal, there are 22 people-based commitments. Most prominent is our diversity target of 40% women in nuclear by 2030. But I think it's important to remember this is a proxy target for a number of other diversity elements, which together will deliver diversity of thought. Clearly, gender is the easiest thing to measure and the one that there's no escaping from, in that every nuclear power station across the UK is in an environment which has a workforce or potential workforce that are 50% women. So there's no ducking away from that target. But as I say, it's just one of a number of targets that we're looking at. And actually, skills transferability equally brings in that diversity of thought, so it's related. Within the other commitments, there are 5 main themes of activity, and as I say, this includes people transferability. And it is important to remember that the people section of the nuclear sector deal is an enabling theme, so it enables the other targets to be delivered. Importantly, it enables those cost reduction targets. And in the decommissioning world, the savings of 20% that we're committing to in the area of decommissioning by 2030, as well as increasing our attractiveness as an export of nuclear skills. So it is important to remember that transferability can drive down costs, can increase innovation, leading to more export opportunities. Next slide, please. Firstly, some definitions. So we're talking a lot about transferability today. We're defining this as the degree to which a person, occupation or competence can be transferred from one sector, subsector or occupation to another. Now, there are a number of dimensions to transferability. You have occupational transferability, so workers who change job roles within an industry. We've got sectoral transferability, where workers move between sectors or from industries within ECI. And then you've also got geographic transferability, which is the sort of physical movement of individuals and skills from one region to another, often called mobility. Next slide, please. So moving on now to spend a bit of time talking through the 3 main skills events that have focused on transferability this year. The first was back in January. It was an NSSG skills event sponsored by the NDA, which focused on mobility and transferability. It pulled together mainly nuclear employers, but we also had some experts from other sectors, notably from oil and gas, speaking around the challenges faced in the oil and gas sector and how they compare to those being faced in the nuclear sector. We adopted a road mapping approach, so we developed a vision, looked at where we were currently, how we were going to get to where we wanted to be and how we were going to get there, and then prioritised some interventions. Some key takeaways from that workshop included a discussion about whether we should be looking at transferability across all areas or whether we should try and bite off smaller chunks and focus more on business critical areas or skill set shortages only. We recognise that transferability is both about behaviours of people but also about the processes that are used to support that transferability. And that transferability requires a shift in mindset, not just skill set. That there is a real case for leadership and sponsorship of the transferability agenda. I think we'll talk more about this in a second, but there's a number of cases where interventions have been put in place, but unless you have the senior sponsorship of those interventions, they don't necessarily get traction. We also talked a lot about choreography, both with the nuclear sector and between the nuclear sector and other sectors, and the skills demands ebb and flow. It's really important to think about whether, what we can do to choreograph the need for skills across different sectors. Importantly, we recognised that we needed to build on the good work already undertaken in this area. We're not starting from a blank slate. There is a lot of effort that has already happened that we can build on. Next slide, please. The next event took place in March. This was an NSSG Skills Summit just before lockdown, as it turned out, and it really took the outputs from the January workshop and focused and prioritised some of those interventions into project delivery plans. We ended up with three main areas of focus. The first covering security and induction and how those can enable more transferability. The second picked up on this issue of leadership and case for change, and how we get senior buy-in and a business case for investing in effort in this area. And finally, we looked at how we can connect competence, recognise competence and test competence, and avoid having to repeat training or testing, thus eliminating costs. Next slide, please. And then finally, I want to talk about the cross-industry collaboration event that took place in May. It was a virtual event. Unfortunately, we were hoping to meet face to face, but we undertook it virtually. Here, there were a number of contributors and attendees. Those are actually listed on the slide. And the main takeaways are equally shared on this slide, but I'll walk you through some of the points that were taken out of each of the contributions on the day. The first thing to note, though, is that there were some a lot of overlap between the kind of the challenges being faced by nuclear and by oil and gas. So firstly, both sectors were recognising that we had an ageing workforce that was going to create problems over the next 5 to 10 years. We both recognised that additional skills development were required for a digital age, that skills needed upgrading to reflect the digital age. There's a recognition that there is a very much more diversified landscape going forward, certainly within nuclear, but also between other energy sources as well, and how net zero will impact on that. There was a recognition of the importance of mobility from areas of decline to areas of growth. You know, even within the nuclear sector, there are peaks and troughs, and there will be times where organisations are sadly letting people go, and other areas of the country where there is still a resource demand. So how we can balance those peaks and troughs was a core issue for both sectors. And we both suffered from a bit of an image issue around the decommissioning aspects. It's not always considered to be the most attractive compared to perhaps shiny new build projects, but both recognise that the UK has considerable depth and breadth in the decommissioning area, and there's a very significant opportunity for us to be able to expand and export on that expertise. We talked too about the title of decommissioning perhaps not being the most exciting, and perhaps by calling it environmental restoration instead would attract more people into work in that area. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to talk through and just pull out some of the key elements from each of the presentations from that day. As I say, there were a number of very very comprehensive presentations reflecting a range of different organisations that have addressed issues around transferability in the past. So if we start off with the National Skills Academy for Nuclear, if you excuse me, I will just read my notes here from time to time to make sure that I don't miss any of the key points that were raised. But the National Skills Academy for Nuclear have been around for a number of years. And what was interesting in their presentation was they recognised that the reasons that they were established are still true today. So the main challenges that they were trying to address then are still relevant now. So firstly, the need to standardise the approaches to skills development. Secondly, to develop flexibility and mobility of workers. Thirdly, to look at the quality of delivery and the impact of quality on competence. And finally, they need to reduce the cost of repeat training. What NSAN were able to talk through were a number of initiatives that have been developed to enable transferability across the years. So they talked through a few of those interventions. So skills passport, an online e-learning portal, top-up programs to deal with kind of consistency of induction and common language in the sector. And as I say, particularly the skills passport NS4P is a very comprehensive way of recording and standardising training received on a readable card. What was interesting is that despite some of these products having been developed with industry and for industry, there are sometimes difficulties in getting them rolled out, and that brings us on to that issue of leadership and sponsorship that I discussed earlier. So then moving on to the NSSG presentation. So this talked through the NSSG workshop, which I've already identified to you today, but then talked through the sort of broader strategic plan that the NSSG follow that does have a number of core themes in it, and just to sort of outline what those themes are outside the area of sector transferability. The NSSG also look at the issue of skills leadership and kind of making the skills landscape in nuclear less complex, as well as running the labour market intelligence, having diversity at its core, and looking at kind of communications and branding of the sector. That all sits in the enhanced skills leadership theme. Then we have local apprenticeships and pathways, so an area that looks at how we bring people in on apprenticeships, and importantly how we mobilise those apprenticeships across the sector. And I think one of the things I'll talk a little bit more about in a second is that perhaps there's a need to build in flexibility at an earlier part of people's careers, or build in mobility at an earlier part of people's careers, so that they become used to being mobile. We have a theme which is particularly focused on high level skills and R&D and innovation. We then have the sector transferability theme, which I'll talk more about in a while, and then we have a theme that looks specifically at how we attract new entrants into our sector. Under the sector transferability area particularly, as I say, we've focused on three core elements that we're driving forward, that we'll talk more about in a second, and certainly would invite support and involvement from people who are listening in today. The next presentation was from Robert Gordon University, and they were talking about some work they'd undertaken on workforce dynamics. Particularly, they looked at four main areas being planned. The first being energy transition, and recognising the fundamental impact this is going to have on the oil and gas industry, recognising that oil and gas production will decline over time, and hydrogen, CCS and wind energy will increase. He talked through the fact that the skills base for these is quite similar, and so as one industry contracts, another will grow. So it's important that that we can create transferability within those energy sectors. He then moved on to talk about technology and innovation, and how we need to drive change to develop new skills in data analytics, new materials and automation. These issues were very common to nuclear as well, that we do need to do things differently going forward. He then talked about the workforce dynamics work, and the huge amount of work that has been undertaken to map the oil and gas workforce, with a data set of about 40,000 roles. And from this data set, he was able to identify that around 80% of those roles were totally transferable to other sectors, particularly wind, carbon capture storage, hydrogen, and in the kind of skill set areas that are very common across all sectors, so project managers, engineers, technicians. He also discussed the fact that overall, it's likely that there is going to be a need for about 40,000 new people. Recognising the energy transition, but also the fact that we've got retirement and attrition. And he reckoned that around 10,000 of those 40,000 roles will be into roles that don't yet exist. So advertising the need for flexibility and continual upskilling, reskilling. Obviously, this research was undertaken pre-COVID, so it's likely that they need to be refreshed. So the main emphasis was around the fact that there's going to need to be an upskilling and right skilling of the existing workforce, to make sure that we can take advantage of those people who will no longer be required in one part of the energy sector, but will be in potentially available and suitable for others. He also talked about the issue of gender balance and had that in common with nuclear and how actually both of our sectors are looking at diversifying the workforce. So then we moved on to a presentation from OG UK, and this was really looking at the economic environment of oil and gas. This was pre-pandemic, or just around just around the beginning of the pandemic, but recognising that oil and gas price had collapsed, but also the pandemic was affecting demand for the product. Therefore, there was a sort of double whammy situation. Again, in that context, there was a real emphasis on the importance of transferable skills. Parts of the oil and gas sector will be losing as many as 30,000 jobs, so it's really timely that we consider how we can transition jobs from one sector to another, whether that's from oil and gas into renewables or nuclear or whatever, but the core issue is around transferability. Then we had a presentation from the NDA, who talked about the importance of oil and gas, the importance of transferability for their people strategy. Obviously, core to them is having the right people in the right place at the right time with the right culture. They talked through the fact that they're trying to restructure their business with greater emphasis on consistency across their business groups. So they've rebranded the group as one NDA. So subsidiaries within the organisation will have more in common with the NDA than they perhaps have done previously, and this will support the ability to be able to transfer within the NDA group of businesses. The NDA talked a lot around secondments and the opportunities for secondments both within the NDA group but also outside of it, and they've done significant work at alleviating some of the barriers to secondments, whether that's terms and conditions or in terms of identifying and promoting secondments, those kind of things. They've undertaken significant work with good success in terms of the ability to transfer people on secondments, which is, I think, a topic that I think we should look at in other areas too. They've done a lot of work on learning lessons and are starting to collate some case studies on those lessons that have been learnt, and particularly the successes of transfers that the NSSG working with the NDA have seen happen. So ECITB supported the transition of a number of individuals from the coal sector into the nuclear sector to prove the concept that actually those skills are eminently transferable. Equally, when new build projects have stalled in nuclear, many of the employees, certainly the apprentices and new recruits, have been able to be picked up and transferred into other organisations in the business. And actually the Nuclear Graduates Programme is at its heart a programme which encourages that kind of transfer. The programme is arranged around a series of secondments into many different organisations over the first 2 years, inside and outside of the nuclear sector, and that experience enables those people to be much more flexible and adaptable going forward. We then had a presentation from Skills Development Scotland on the economic impact of net zero and the opportunity of green recovery as a response to the pandemic. I think Skills Development Scotland recognise that energy transitions need skilled transitions. So at their core, we need to be looking at how skills can transition and how we focus on fair and just transitions between sectors to ensure that vulnerable and declining areas are supported. They recognise that that there will be implications for all skills levels and across all occupational areas of this kind of transition, and therefore and there are three areas which really we need to focus on. The first is behavioural. All jobs will require higher levels of environmental awareness. Secondly, adaptation to take into account new technology and regulation and market demands. And thirdly, specialist changes to existing skills and new knowledge based on climate change. And then finally, there was a presentation by ECITB on a piece of research that they have undertaken recently, which I'll just pick through briefly to explain to you some of the key findings from that. So next slide, please. So here is just an outline of the research that was undertaken. It was undertaken in October, between October and February, so pre-COVID, mainly qualitative and with 48 telephone interviews. The main research questions were around transferability, the barriers to transferability, and understanding what companies are doing to address skills shortages. Next slide, please. Here is a list of those barriers to transferability, 7 barriers. I'm not going to read them out, but they range from sort of the complexity of language, of the perception of how difficult it is for individuals to join new organisations, the perception that it's difficult for individuals' skills and qualifications to be recognised in other sectors. Recruitment methods show that individuals are being screened out where they haven't got multiple years of experience within a sector, despite the fact that their core technical skills are completely transferable. The issue of mobility is another one I'll just pick out there, the difficulties for people to be mobile and what causes those difficulties. Next slide, please. So just developing more on that issue of mobility, here are some of the barriers identified, ranked from 1 to 10, with 10 being high. So obviously impact of family and social life are important here, but also the cost and access to public transport are also important to people's ability to be mobile. But this is recognising that this is assuming that you need to be geographically mobile to move from one organisation to another. And as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, perhaps one thing we have learned is that there are different ways of doing things that we should explore to minimise the need to be away, to have to commute, blah de blah. So it's important to think differently about the way we're working. Next slide, please. So here are the 3 top level conclusions that all effectively recognise that skills transferability will help the sector, both in terms of the ability to meet skill shortages. There is a recognition that larger companies might be better placed to use transferability to meet their skills needs, perhaps an area that smaller organisations miss. And therefore this is perhaps something that the government could help with. Next slide, please. And then there are 7 recommendations that the report made, which you can see in more detail. I'll share the link shortly, but these are the recommendations that effectively might form the foundations for some action in this space where it hasn't already happened. In some cases there already work going on or has gone on, so the mapping piece, I know that there's some work happening here. In other areas there's stuff that we can start or to develop, and certainly these recommendations form the basis of some of the activities that the nuclear sector are focusing on. Next slide, please. So those are some other recommendations from that report. Next slide. This is the report link. I assume the slides will be shared and you can see the full report there, but if not, ECITB, you'll be able to download it from there. Next slide, please. So for the last minute or two, how are the nuclear sector taking this forward? So we recognise there's much more we need to do, but we also recognise that there is significant opportunity from doing more in this space. And we also recognise that this is one area of our delivery plan that is going to be very much enhanced through working with other people from other sectors, that we need cross-sector action in this space. Next slide, please. So I've already mentioned that we have 3 kind of core delivery areas now of activities that we think are priorities. There are probably we should put a 4th there, which is around cross-sector interventions, and indeed I think cross-sector involvement in those first 3 would also be really important. So again, just to emphasise for me, the case for change, the business case about why we're doing this and the benefits that can be gained from this is really important. So that leadership strategy and case for change action is, I think, probably our priority. And I'm certain that involvement from others in the sector on this call can help with that. I think we need to maintain a focus on measuring those benefits throughout. And basically, I guess this is a bit of a call to action. If anybody who's listening has been triggered in any way by anything that I've said and would like to be involved with the activities that we're undertaking, then please get in touch. Next slide. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. Obviously, we've now got a little bit of time for some questions, but equally, if you don't get a chance to ask your question today but are interested in finding out more, then please get in touch. Okay, many thanks, and please over to you.